letting us know that you were here and wanting to know about anything else that the Southeastern Connecticut Peace and Justice Network is doing, should please just sign in and give us a way to contact you in the future. I'm Ann Scheibner, and on behalf of the Southeastern Connecticut Peace and Justice Network, I'd like to welcome you to this evening, which is being sponsored by the Amal Project, which is one of the offshoots of the Peace and Justice Network. And I hope all of you have had a chance to look at Amal Awan's work, her paintings, and the prints that the project that we're involved with here in Southeastern Connecticut tried to make reproductions of her work available as a way of supporting her and as a way of making good on Chris's having taken the stewardship of the 50 canvases that she thrust into his hand as he was leaving Iraq before the invasion last year. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at her work, that's part of the idea for the reception following Chris's talk, is to be able to look at them, and we would be delighted to accept your orders for prints, and after the show is over, we'd be delighted to sell you the originals. So be sure to get a copy of the price list and all of that. You've also been given copies of another project. One of the geniuses of the Southeastern Connecticut Peace Network is that the network really never has to sponsor anything. We don't have to have a constitution and a way of making decisions, because when something appears that needs to be done, the group of people who want to do it get together and make decisions about that and then do their best to share it. So one of the other projects that's been taking form is the Voluntown Peace Farm, which many of you may know about, and we have the opportunity to support the Hartford Catholic Worker. And during the announcement time, I'll say a little bit more about that, but that's part of why you have that information tonight, because it'll be a chance for you to meet some of the people who are involved with that project during the reception time and decide if you too would like to become involved in that. We'd like to thank First Church for their hospitality to us tonight, and for their hospitality to the Amal Project and making their wonderful gallery space available to us, and Peter Hawkins for being custodian in charge of our having access to this wonderful sanctuary. So we thank you very much, and we're delighted to be here. The schedule for the evening is up here. Can everyone see it? Any questions? We've had hopefully the chance to see her work is the preview, and now chance to hear from Chris, and then later following the reception get together more informally, and 9 o'clock is the end of our evening here. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Allen Doucot. Although many of you know him already, both from his coming to St. Francis House, where I live and work 2 years ago, was it? I mean, it was 2 years ago when, we knew the Hartford Catholic Worker was involved with Iraq, but, who really knew why, or why that would be important, or what sanctions were about. And this was long before any inkling of how important and convulsing it would be for this country. It really came up on I will speak for myself, on my radar screen. And then Chris was one of the people who participated in the forum that took place at Three Rivers Community College also last spring, and spoke with, along with Representative Simmons and a number of weapons experts. And I must say it was very impressive, the range and the depth of Chris's knowledge, past and present, of what was going on in Iraq. He's visited the country 8 times. He is the husband to Jackie Allen, who's here tonight, the father of 2 sons, and I think that involvement in the life of the community here makes all the more important the perspective that he's going to bring to us tonight about what's happening in Iraq and the ongoing conflict there. So without further ado, Chris.
obviously, Iraq's in the news a lot these past few days. But before I speak about the current events, the happenings of the past week or even the past year, I feel obliged to give some historical perspective to put things into a context. The war in Iraq just didn't happen out of thin air. Saddam Hussein didn't appear out of thin air. And to make sense of what's happening today, we need to have some bit of historical context. And so if you could bear with me, I'm going to provide some of that this evening. And to stay focused, I'm going to do a lot of reading tonight because otherwise I'll get distracted and go off on a tangent. It's shorter this way. This is the birthplace of Western civilization, right here. We all learn about this when we're in middle school, right? Also, if we come from the Jewish, the Christian, or the Muslim faith tradition, place of our civilization and of our faith tradition. The national boundaries of the modern Middle East were created by France and Britain after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. In 1921, Sir Percy Cox of the British Colonial Office drew the border between what is today Iraq and Kuwait. Prior to 1921, Kuwait had been considered a part of Basra, which is today Iraq's southern governorate. This arbitrary demarcation kept Iraq from having meaningful deep port access to the Persian Gulf. In 1958, a popular uprising overthrew the British-installed monarchy in Iraq. The new leader of Iraq, Abdel Karim Qasem, began to nationalize Western holdings in Iraq. In 1963, Qasem was overthrown by a CIA-supported coup. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party, which was the party of Saddam Hussein, came to power in Iraq. In 1972, Iraq announced the nationalization of its oil industry. And for the next 18 years, Iraq used the revenue from the sale of oil to increase public spending in education and in healthcare, and also in the military. Illiteracy in Iraq dropped consistently as education was free through the level of PhD. Infant mortality and malnutrition rates also readily dropped as healthcare was free to everyone in the country, and the level of care was consistent with that received by people in Western Europe. On the day before Iraq announced that it was nationalizing their oil industry, the Nixon administration placed Iraq on the list of states which sponsored terrorism. Meanwhile, President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, began working with the Shah of Iran to arm Kurdish separatists in northern Iraq. It is important to note what was going on around the same time in neighboring Iran, because it's going to have an impact on what's happened, but also what's going to be happening in the coming months and years. In 1951, the Shah of Iran was voted out of office with the new government of Prime Minister Mossadegh. Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry so that the oil revenue could be used to alleviate domestic poverty rather than enrich British investors. The Shah, what he had done is he led a very lavish lifestyle. And to pay for that, he sold off the rights to Iran's oil, to British Petroleum. Iran was immediately subjected to economic sanctions. 2 years later, the CIA played a direct role in the overthrow of the Mossadegh government, replacing his democratic rule with that of the despot Shah Reza Pahlavi. During the following 27 years, the Shah catered to Western interests while ruling Iran dictatorially. The Savak, the secret police formed in part by General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., acted as the Shah's main tool of oppression. In 1979, the Shah was overthrown by a popular fundamentalist Islamic uprising, during which, of course, 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. When the socialist and Arab Iraq invaded the fundamentalist and Persian Iran in 1980, the United States was silent. Saddam Hussein understood himself to be the defender of the Arab and largely Sunni world against the feared spread of a fundamentalist Shia movement. By 1982, Iraq began to lose ground to the war to Iran, in the war to Iran. The Washington Post reported on December 30th, 2002, this is a lengthy quote, "To prevent an Iraqi collapse, the Reagan administration supplied battlefield intelligence on Iranian troop buildups to the Iraqis. The U.S. tilt toward Iraq was enshrined in National Security Directive 114 of November 26, 1983. According to former U.S. officials, the directive stated that the United States would do whatever was necessary and legal to prevent Iraq from losing the war with Iran." The Post story continued, "The presidential directive was issued amid a flurry of reports that Iraqi forces were using chemical weapons in their attempts to hold back the Iranians." On November 1st, 1983, a senior State Department official, Jonathan Howe, told Secretary of State George Shultz that intelligence reports showed that Iraqi troops were resorting to almost daily use of chemical weapons against the Iranians. But the Reagan administration had already committed itself to a large-scale diplomatic and political overture to Baghdad, culminating in several visits by the president's recently appointed special envoy to the Middle East, Donald Rumsfeld, who of course is today's Secretary of Defense. When Rumsfeld finally met with Hussein on December 20th, 1983, he told the Iraqi leader that Washington was ready for a resumption of full diplomatic relations. According to a State Department report of the conversation, in a September 2002 interview with CNN, Rumsfeld said he cautioned Hussein about the use of chemical weapons, a claim at odds with declassified State Department notes of his 90-minute meeting with the Iraqi leader. Further on in the Post story, a sworn affidavit from former National Security Council official Howard Teicher is quoted saying that the United States actively supported the Iraqi war effort by supplying the Iraqis with billions of dollars of credits, by providing military intelligence and advice to the Iraqis, and by closely monitoring third country arms sales to Iraq to make sure Iraq had the military weaponry required. Finally, the piece reported, a 1994 investigation by the Senate Banking Committee turned up dozens of biological agents shipped to Iraq during the mid-'80s under license from the U.S. Commerce Department, including various strains of anthrax. The Commerce Department also approved the export of insecticides to Iraq, despite widespread suspicion that they were being used for chemical warfare. In late 1987, the Iraqi Air Force began using chemical agents against Kurdish resistance forces in northern Iraq. In a September 1988 memo, then Assistant Secretary of State Richard Murphy wrote, "We believe that economic sanctions in response to Iraq's use of chemical weapons will be useless or counterproductive to influence the Iraqis." This prescient statement about the futility of sanctions as a method of political coercion was echoed under vastly different circumstances 2 years later by then CIA Director William Webster. On December 5th, 1990, while testifying before the House Armed Services Committee about the possible imposition of sanctions on Iraq in response to the invasion of Kuwait, Mr. Webster said, "Our judgment has been, and continues to be, that there is no assurance or guarantee that economic hardships will compel Saddam to change his policies or lead to internal unrest that would threaten his regime." End quote. In 1988, at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was desperate to sell oil at a stable price to generate revenue to rebuild what had been destroyed. Iraq's efforts towards this end were hampered and even blocked by neighboring Kuwait. During the Iran-Iraq war, Kuwait took control of 900 square miles of Iraq's Rumaila oil field. Also during the war, Kuwait helped fund the Iraqi war effort to the total of $30 billion. On August 8, 1988, the day after Iran agreed to cease fire with Iraq, Kuwait dramatically increased oil production. This act caused world oil prices to slump. Of course, since Iraq's economy is totally dependent on the sale of oil, slumping prices cost Iraq billions of dollars of potential revenue. For 2 years, Iraq tried to resolve this issue diplomatically. A senior official from the first Bush administration told New York Newsday, in a story from 1991, quote, Kuwait was overproducing oil, and when the Iraqis came and said, can't you do something about it, the Kuwaitis said, sit on it. And they didn't even say it nicely. They were nasty about it, they were stupid, they were arrogant, they were terrible, close quote. During the months leading up to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, senior U.S. officials continued to meet with or defend the Hussein regime. In April 1990, Senator Robert Dole traveled to Iraq with 4 other U.S. senators to meet with Saddam to talk business and reassure him that the United States was still with him. On May 1st, 1990, when questioned at a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee whether the United States should respond to Iraq's willingness to use chemical and biological weapons and to threaten Israel with missiles, then Secretary of State James Baker said that such a judgment would be, quote, a little bit premature, adding that in all probability our allies will be very quick to move in there and pick up our market share. On July 25th, 1990, with Iraq amassing troops on the border with Kuwait, U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie delivered a cable to Saddam which read in part, our, that being the United States, opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country. We have no opinion on Arab-Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Close quote. Doubtless that the United States would look the other way, as we had done a decade earlier with the invasion of Iran, Saddam ordered Iraqi troops into Kuwait on August 2nd. By August 6th, the United States had pushed through the UN Security Council a resolution which froze Iraq's foreign assets and imposed the most comprehensive sanctions regimen ever on the people of Iraq. It must be noted that Iraq was then and is now dependent on foreign imports for upwards of 70% of its food supply and other items necessary for a modern society to function. A Defense Intelligence Agency memo dated January 18, 1991, this would be about 5 or 6 months into the sanctions. This memo was declassified in 1995. This memo stated, Iraq depends on importing specialized equipment and some chemicals to purify its water supply. Failure to secure supplies will result in a shortage of pure drinking water for much of the population. This could lead to increased incidences, if not epidemics, of disease. Unless water treatment supplies are exempted from the UN sanctions for humanitarian reasons, no adequate solution exists for Iraq's water purification dilemma. Unless the water is purified with chlorine, epidemics of such diseases as cholera, hepatitis, and typhoid could occur. Recent reports indicate the chlorine supply is critically low. Its importation has been embargoed. Iraq could try convincing the United Nations or individual nations to exempt water treatment supplies by using some sympathetic countries as fronts. If such attempts fail, Iraqi alternatives are not adequate for their national requirements. The entire Iraqi water treatment system will not collapse precipitously. Full degradation of the water treatment system probably will take at least another 6 months. The administration of the first President Bush waited 5 months for this degradation to occur before he assured it through the most massive bombing campaign the world had known to that date. During the first Gulf War, the United States dropped 88,500 tons of bombs on Iraq. Our bombs damaged or destroyed 676 schools, 95 hospitals or clinics, 139 bridges, every major water and sewage treatment plant, and every electrical power plant. The bombing destroyed Iraq's ability to generate electricity. The following 12 years of sanctions prevented Iraq from completely restoring electricity to the nation. In the days before the Second Gulf War, most of the country still experienced 2 3-hour blackouts a day. Since the Second Gulf War, the supply of electricity has been further diminished due to bombings, looting, and guerrilla warfare. Reporting on the civilian damage incurred during the first Gulf War, the Washington Post reported in 1991, quote, the worst civilian suffering, senior American officials say, has resulted not from bombs that went astray, but from precision-guided weapons that hit exactly where they were aimed. at electrical plants, oil refineries, and transportation networks. Now, nearly 4 months after the war's end, Iraq's electrical generation has reached only 20 to 25% of its pre-war capacity. Pentagon analysts calculate that the country has roughly the generating capacity it had in 1920, before reliance on refrigeration and sewage treatment became widespread. Pentagon officials declined 2 written requests for a review of the 28 electrical targets and explanations of their specific military relevance. People say, "You didn't recognize that it was going to have an effect on water or sewage," said the planning officer. Well, what were we trying to do with the sanctions? Help out the Iraqi people? No. What we were doing with the attacks was to accelerate the effects of the sanctions. Close quote. The resulting effects of the bombings and sanctions on the Iraqi people during the preceding 5,000 children a month died during that decade as a result of the conditions created by the bombings and the sanctions. In 1999, UNICEF wrote that only 10% of Iraq's garbage collection vehicles were operational. Consequently, UNICEF reported an outbreak of cholera in 1999. Likewise, there was a tripling in the incidence of measles and whooping cough and a rise in polio. UNICEF specifically cited the lack of electricity as a vital factor in the breakdown of the cold chain system, which is essential to the delivery and storage of food and medicines like insulin or the polio vaccine. During this same period, the United States blocked the shipment of childhood vaccines to Iraq, claiming they could be used for biological weapons. Benan Savan of the UN Iraq program told the Security Council that vaccines for measles, mumps, rubella, pneumonia, tetanus, and hepatitis were and still are in short supply in Iraq. In a story written by the French press agency, Mr. Savan is quoted, "These shortages are exposing the Iraqi population to normally preventable infections. The lack of vaccines would mean that 4.7 million children under the age of 5 countrywide are at risk." By 1999, UNICEF was reporting that 250 to 300 tons of solid, untreated raw sewage was being discharged directly into the rivers each day. This is the photograph of some of the pumps from a sewage treatment plant in Basra. The pumps were scavenged during the decades of the 90s for spare parts to keep whatever pumps operational that they could. This boy here is working at a sewage treatment plant in Baghdad. It's maybe 110 degrees at this point. His job is to walk in circles all day, separating the solid human waste from the sludge here when the power went out or when the pumps weren't working. So he just walked in circles all day in a slurry of feces up to his ankles and sometimes his knees. The World Health Organization reported that the severity of Iraq's humanitarian situation stems from the massive and swift degradation of the country's civilian infrastructure, aggravated by over 10 years of economic and trade isolation. Overall health conditions of the population remain poor, well below the 1990 levels. Environmental hazards continue unrelieved. Food availability and consumption fall short of requirements, impacting the nutritional status of large parts of the population. Chronic malnutrition is widespread, especially among the growing children. The functionality of water and sanitation plants is adversely affected by the lack of spare parts. This is the main sewage treatment plant for the southern city of Basra. As you see, it's empty because the pumps that should be feeding it weren't operational. And so the sewage was being discharged directly into the river down there, the Shatt al-Arab. Those utilities, that would be the water and sanitation plants, also require repair and rehabilitation as unsafe drinking water, unhygienic environment, and poor sewage systems continue to endanger large sections of the Iraqi population. That's raw sewage backed up in the streets of the city of Basra. In 1999, 3.5 million Iraqi children under the age of 5 were malnourished. Iraq has a population today of about 23 million people. These slides I never updated because the situation never improved. According to UNICEF, in a given month prior to the sanctions, this one was from March 1990, about 550 children under the age of 5 succumbed to these conditions. With the bombing of the infrastructure and the imposition of sanctions, upwards of 5,000 children a month, as I quoted UNICEF earlier, were dying each month because of those same conditions. A sharp rise in the cases of malnutrition. I should have updated this one because the situation actually got worse. The bars on the left are per capita income, food supply of different food groups for a typical Iraqi, and the bars on the right are those same food groups for a typical American. As you can see, they're barely eating, and we're eating way too much. Throughout the decade of the 90s, domestic food availability plummeted in Iraq. The breadbasket of Iraq was up in the northern part of the country, which was outside of control of Baghdad. It was being controlled by the United Nations. The ability for Iraq to feed its people was never something they could do on their own. They were encouraged by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization to import 2/3 of its annual food supply at a cost of roughly $2 billion. Their domestic production plummeted during the 90s because of damage to the infrastructure and the inability to buy pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides and farm equipment. And so for all the various food groups, the availability plummeted. And of course, the result is what you see with children like this. This little child here, his name is Sajah Ali. Sajah weighed 3 3/4 pounds. His child's ideal weight should have been 11 pounds. This child got sick because he was fed infant formula that was mixed with the water, the only water that's available, which is not adequately treated, and so it's frankly not safe. Breastfeeding in Iraq is much more commonplace than it is here in the United States. Even women who wear the head covering breastfeed and breastfeed in public. Breastfed in front of me, a man from another culture no less. This mom tried to breastfeed her baby, but she herself was anemic and malnourished, and so her breasts simply failed to produce milk. And so she was forced to feed her baby with the only food available, which was powdered formula that was mixed with contaminated water. The wards in Baghdad and in Basra, Amara, Nazariya were filled with children like this. The under 5 mortality rate is a standard indicator of the health of a society. What I've done here is I have a comparison of the under 5 mortality rate for Iran and Iraq. They have similar economies, similar socioeconomic conditions. They're neighboring countries. They fought a war against each other during the decade of the 80s. You can see from 1960 through 1990, Iraq, which is the green, had a lower under 5 mortality rate than Iran. And both nations experienced a steady decline in the under 5 mortality rate during that 50-year period. Even during the decade in which these countries had a war, they both experienced a decline in the under 5 mortality rate. Starting in 1991, Iraq's under 5 mortality rate begins to rise steadily, while Iran's continues to fall and now is below Iraq's. A similar trend occurred with the infant mortality rate for both countries. Aside from the economic war raged on Iraq during the 90s, the United States also fought a largely unreported conventional war on Iraq. According to U.S. Central Command, during the 1990s, United States warplanes flew in excess of 100,000 missions over Iraq. Throughout the decade, the U.S. bombed Iraq between 1 and 3 times a week, with bombings peaking during 1998's Operation Desert Fox. In 1999 alone, American warplanes dropped 1,000 missiles on Iraq. In a typical year, $1 billion was spent on this war. For perspective's sake, though, on the opening night of so-called shock and awe back in March of 2003, American forces launched 1,000 missiles on Baghdad alone. At a cost of $1 million per missile, the opening night of this war cost us $1 billion. We spent $1 billion the first night of this war. During the 1990s, between 500 and 1,500 Iraqi civilians were killed by these bombings. Gratefully, not a single American warplane was hit by Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery. In a January 11, 1999 Boston Globe story, conservative Florida Republican Porter Goss is quoted about this low-level warfare saying, "It's a strange thing for Americans to agree to be bombing another civilization of innocent people because we don't like the guy who is running the railroad. This is not good for many reasons, including what I cynically call collateral damage, by which I mean arms and legs and human beings." End quote. This slide here, I'm holding some shrapnel from an AGM-130. It's an air-to-ground cruise missile that landed in this neighborhood here, the Jumeirah neighborhood of the southern city of Basra, on January 25th, 1999. When I interviewed people at the Pentagon about this missile, they told me that before it's launched, the ground coordinates, the latitude and longitude, are programmed in because it has global positioning equipment on board, and it uses the satellites in space to reach its destination. And from the moment it's launched, with just those ground coordinates programmed in, it's said to be accurate to within 10 meters, 10 yards of those ground coordinates. When it approaches its destination, the weapon systems operator, the pilot, takes manual control of the weapon in the cockpit. And there's a television camera in the nose cone of the missile. And so he can see where it's heading, and he can choose, quote, the window pane or the doorknob that he chooses to hit. This missile landed in the middle of this neighborhood, killed 7 civilians and injured many more. One of those injured was this little boy here, Hasham Ali. He's holding in his hand a piece of shrapnel that tore through his home and through his leg that day. This woman here, warn you that the images are graphic, lost 3 of her daughters, all under the age of 7, to the missile. The target the United States was trying to hit that day was a fertilizer factory in the village of Abu Falus, which is maybe 20 or 30 miles as the crow flies from the neighborhood where those girls were killed. The fertilizer factory, I visited it this past March. It's still standing. This little girl, her name is Isra, she lost her arm. She lives in that village because some of the missiles did make it to the village, which is a desperately poor place. And she lost her arm to the missile. This woman here, her name is Haider. Her given name is Iqbal Fartus. Means mother in Arabic. Haider was the name of her oldest boy who was killed by the missile that day. Her younger boy, Mustafa, was also severely wounded. He lost a part of his hand and his body was covered in shrapnel. I brought Haider and Mustafa to the United States back in March, and I returned them to Iraq this past January and February. This is Mustafa's rear side. On another of my visits, Latana Najaf, which is one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, was hit by 2 cluster bombs. By the way, we're using cluster bombs as we stopped, we allegedly have a ceasefire right now, but over the weekend we used cluster bombs in Fallujah. A cluster bomb is an anti-personnel weapon. It is not designed to destroy military hardware or buildings. It's designed to maim and injure human beings. Frankly, it's not even designed necessarily to kill them, but to induce major traumatic injuries, because that's more of a drain on a society's resources, because society will then have to care for the injured person rather than just bury a body. The Pentagon said that their target this day was an anti-aircraft battery. Now, I remind you, during the hundreds of thousands of missions we flew over Iraq during the 90s, never once was an American warplane hit by Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery. This is because American warplanes were flying at 25,000 feet, beyond the range of Iraq's anti-aircraft artillery. Regardless, if we wanted to take out anti-aircraft artillery, we wouldn't use a cluster bomb. A cluster bomb would kill the people around the anti-aircraft artillery, but it would leave the artillery itself pretty much unscathed. I was able to recover some of the shrapnel. I brought it home with me, The attack that day, you can see here, one of the bombs landed in this road. One side were homes, the other side were mechanics' garages. There's not much of a crater there. It's not designed to leave much of a crater. A cluster bomb is a bomb that's made up of dozens, and some models, hundreds of smaller bomblets. They don't all explode upon impact. Frankly, there are still cluster bomblets in Cambodia and Vietnam, tearing off the arms and legs of children from 30 and 40 years ago. There are cluster bomblets left over from the first Gulf War in Iraq, and we've added thousands more that are now scattered around Baghdad from the latest Gulf War. The sort of damage that a cluster bomblet does is it puts holes about the size of a grapefruit in buildings. The second bomb landed about a mile away on the grounds of a plant that processed grain, a big grain mill. This was the home for the engineer of the facility. And the pock marks you see are, again, much of the damage that was caused by the shrapnel. The force of the blast blew out the windows in the home. But the bomb itself killed 11 civilians and severely wounded 18 or 19 others. Recall the quote by Congressman Porter Goss about arms and legs and human beings. This woman here, her 7-year-old boy, lost his arm to that cluster bomb. I took this photo the day after the attack in the hospital in Doucot, where I was welcomed instead of run out the door. I brought home some of the shrapnel, and an artist, Meg Blazin from New Haven, was able to construct it into a piece of sculpture that's down there. The sculpture in its lap is the piece of the shrapnel, and the yellow on either side of the sculpture are also part of the shrapnel, which forms like a honeycomb that the smaller bomblets are encased in. Also, during the war, the United States used a material in its weaponry called depleted uranium. Sounds innocuous enough, right? It's depleted uranium. Well, it's depleted only because the uranium-238, one of the uranium isotopes, has been removed from it. Uranium-238, which is needed for a sustained nuclear reaction, which is needed for our nuclear weapons to work, occurs in nature less than 1% of the time. And so to get enough of this uranium isotope, we have thousands of tons of all the other uranium isotopes left over. And it was a hazardous waste problem for our nation. We didn't know what to do with this toxic and radioactive substance. Physicists discovered it had some pretty helpful properties for the military. It's very dense, more dense than lead, and so it's used as a ballast in ships. It's nearly impenetrable, and so it's used as armor on our tanks. And it can penetrate just about anything, and so it's used on the tips of many of our rockets and shells. The A-10 Warthogs that fly out of, I think it's either Bradley or Barnes up in Bradley in Connecticut or Barnes in Massachusetts, they shoot these depleted uranium rounds. During the first Gulf War, we left behind over 350 tons of this radioactive and toxic heavy metal all over the country. There's been an explosion in children like this child being born with major congenital deformities. On one of my trips, I was in the delivery room, the maternity ward of a hospital in Basra, and a woman was giving birth as I was there with a delegation of folks. And the doctor brought out the child that had just been born. And the child was missing his head and neck and arms. I went down to the morgue at this children's hospital, and the morgue was filled with children that had been born that past week with similar deformities. American Gulf War veterans from the first Gulf War are reporting that they are having children born with similar deformities. Life magazine did a story about this almost 10 years ago now, called The Tiny Victims of Desert Storm. You can find it on their website still. Many Gulf War veterans and Iraqi scientists believe that Gulf War syndrome, a sharp rise in the cases of cancer in Iraq, and these congenital deformities are a result of exposure to depleted uranium. At our debate, or forum, whatever it was, if you remember, Congressman Simmons denied that we used depleted uranium in this war, which was kind of interesting because when I went home that night, just to check that I wasn't imagining that we used it again, I went and I searched through a bunch of newspapers online, And it turns out that either the day of our forum or the previous day, the Pentagon had just issued a press statement acknowledging that yes, we again used depleted uranium, but that the stuff is basically harmless. These are some images from the latest round of the war. Some of them are very graphic and disturbing, so again, I warn you. Today, I'm worried about a rise in extremist, fundamentalist misinterpretation of Islam in Iraq. 5 years ago, in an interview with the Deputy UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq, Fareed Zarif, an Afghani who was living in exile from the Taliban at the time, I was told, in 5 years, a new generation will take over that is less educated, more hostile to perceived enemies, less stable psychologically, less confident in the future, and less competent. 5 years ago, a man who was living in exile from the fundamentalist Taliban movement predicted that this is what we would have in Iraq today in positions of leadership. Paranoid, incompetent, fearful, unstable people. Elsewhere, he is quoted as saying that the American-led policy of bombings and sanctions was, quote, planting the seeds of violence, of vengeance, the seeds of hatred among the young people of Iraq. In response, the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, has formed an interim government that does not include representatives of the Grand Ayatollah Sistani, the most popular and important leader of Iraqis' Shia Muslims. During Hussein's rule, thousands of Shia leaders and their followers fled to neighboring Iran. It is a reasonable fear that many of these returning exiles were negatively influenced by the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran and may harbor deep suspicion about American motives in Iraq. Meanwhile, the U.S. has included Ahmed Chalabi and the Iraq National Congress in the interim government. Mr. Chalabi and some of his paramilitaries were flown into Iraq by the Pentagon during the war. Mr. Chalabi has no base of support in Iraq. In fact, Mr. Chalabi fled neighboring Jordan in the trunk of a car after embezzling $300 million from a bank there. If he returns to Jordan, he will be imprisoned to 22 years in prison. I am also concerned about the implications of the desire among most Kurds for an independent Kurdistan carved out of northern Iraq. Aside from northern Iraq, there are significant Kurdish populations in neighboring Turkey and Iran. A push for an Iraqi Kurdistan could inspire uprisings in Turkey and Iran, which would certainly provoke military responses. Turkey has already stated that they would interpret increased Kurdish independence as a threat to Turkish sovereignty, to which Turkey would respond militarily. Finally, just as the American military base in the Muslim Holy Land of Saudi Arabia has been a target and a perceived justification for terrorist attacks, so too will a continued American military presence in Iraq. Aside from Baghdad being recognized as the Rome of the Arab world, the Iraqi cities of Najaf and Karbala are home to the second and third most holy sites in Islam. There was a brief moment of extreme optimism in the United States when the Soviet Union collapsed. You folks remember this? We had all this talk of a peace dividend. With the Cold War over, there no longer existed a justification for the arms race. The potential existed for investment of billions of dollars in creating real national security through investment in public health, education, housing, transportation, and the environment. These hopes quickly evaporated as maneuvers were made to replace communism with Islam as a threat to the free world. In the journal The New Statesman, February 8, 1991, British journalist John Pilger reported that the National Security Council presented a white paper to the first President Bush in May of 1990, describing Iraq and Saddam Hussein as, quote, the optimum contenders to replace the Warsaw Pact as justification for a continuation of Cold War level military spending. This white paper was presented to the president less than a month after